Well, this is Ed Stetzer Live, and of course, I'm Ed Stetzer. It's kind of a special show today. I mean, it's not probably that different for you, but it's different for me. And my guest is amazing. Our guests are all amazing. But today, I'm actually in Chicago. I'm actually here preaching the 25th anniversary of the church I used to serve in the western suburbs of Chicago as a teaching pastor at High Point Church. So I'll be preaching there this weekend. All the campuses are coming together in Naperville, so excited about that. As a matter of fact, Chicago's a special place for me. I'm here at Moody Bible Institute. I'm here at Moody Radio, the studios here in downtown Chicago. I just went over to Moody Church, where I had the privilege of serving as the interim pastor there for 4 years. Took some pictures. I don't know. I'm in a reminiscing kind of mood. I went last night to the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. I just prayed for a bit, and so it's good to be back in Chicago. Though my. Karen Hendren, it is cold here. It is cold here. You don't have to. She just give me the thumbs up. It is cold. I mean, I'm like and it was colder last week. They tell me. So I came from. I actually came yesterday morning. I had breakfast in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, where I was with the Pentecostal Charismatic Churches of North America, with the kind of leaders of these Pentecostal Charismatic denominations. I flew right to Chicago, and I reminded myself of how cold it is. Anyway. But it's good to be here and to see our team. We got a great team. Merle St. James is our engineer. You hear me mention them each week because I'm thankful for them and the good work that they do. I've already mentioned Karen Hendren, and assistant producer, actually, Lisa Jempty is here as well. And Titus is manning the phone, so we're going to go out and have a little lunch afterwards and visit. It's good. But it's good to be here in downtown Chicago. I'm thankful for the work of Moody Radio. I should tell you that before I became a host of Moody Radio, Don and I were financial supporters of Moody Radio. So I love Moody Radio and Moody Bible Institute. And actually, weird connection. So I'm the dean of the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. And if you look back in our great-grandparent pictures, Moody Bible Institute and Talbot, Biola basically are the same people. You know, people like R.A. Torrey and others. There's a very strong connection between those institutions as well. So anyway, but we have a great guest today, and we're going to, of course, take your calls and open up our whole conversation as well. So our guest today is John Onwuchekwa, and he's the North American Senior Director for Thought Leadership and Innovation at Redeemer City to City. Can I just say I want to be the Senior Director for Thought Leadership and Innovation? What a great title. John's abiding belief is that tragedy doesn't ruin anyone, hopelessness does. He's a former church planner and pastor with 16 years of practical ministry experience. He brings a wealth of hard-won wisdom to everything he does. John, thanks for joining us on Ed Stetzer Live today.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Yeah, glad to be here with y'all.
Well, you've kind of leaned into a subject that's I don't know. It's almost a subject a lot of people don't want to talk about, and that's in and around these issues of let's have you tell the story. Let's have you tell the story first. Tell me a little bit of your own story, your own journey, maybe related to Sam and more, and let's lean in on the conversation.
Yeah, well, 10 years ago, so April 14th, 2015, I was in Orlando, Florida, getting ready to speak at a Gospel Coalition conference on heaven, and I'm at dinner with a friend, Mark Dever, and I get a bunch of phone calls. And it is so funny, the things that you remember on the worst day of your life. I remember the floor plan of the Longhorn Steakhouse. I remember how hot it was and warm it was. And I remember how effortlessly the people's faces twisted in between shock and horror and despair as they saw me scream the words into my iPhone, "He's dead." So my 32-year-old brother passed suddenly. He was a pastor, Memphis, just kind of went to sleep in his car after a premarital counseling appointment and didn't wake up. And my world was crushed. Finding out he passed was the second biggest surprise in my life. The first biggest surprise in my life was seeing how quickly my faith just kind of nosedived, crumbled. I spent my adult life telling people how good and kind and discerning that God was. And my brother passed 6 weeks before we're getting ready to plant the last church that I did 10 years ago. And I just realized how unprepared I was for the one thing that is inevitable for every single person. Every single person is going to find themselves in a scenario like that. And I remember the way that my life fell apart after that next year. And as soon friends, family were the ones that helped me to climb out of that pit. And as soon as I climbed up out of that pit, my heart was just gripped with the fact of people are going to continue to stumble down this pit of grief and loss. And there's just not much here that I personally found that was helpful. And so it was, hey, I just really want to lean in. I want to throw the ball to where I know everybody's going to reluctantly run to.
Yeah, and hard truths. But the book, by the way, is We Go On, Finding Purpose in All of Life's Sorrows and Joys. And it's, of course, built some on the book of Ecclesiastes as well. I told you before we came on the air that I just got some news. Someone I care deeply about is facing a terminal diagnosis, and so when we booked you for the show, I did not know this. This is like 4 or 5 days old, and so we're feeling this as well. And so I know that this is something that, I mean, everybody gets that call at some point. Maybe
That call?
maybe not as young as your brother. And I should add, I lost a sister at 20 of a rare form of cancer. So man, grief's real, and we sort of face kind of an uncertainty, of how we'll respond. I mean, everybody, you were a pastor at the time. I'm a teaching pastor at church and a dean of a seminary. But at the end of the day, everybody sort of knows that that you have to lean in. So I mentioned I was yesterday down in Cabo, and the day before I was with the PCCNA, the Pentecostal Charismatic Churches in North America, and they were singing, and I was singing with them. I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. So it's kind of a hard thing because the psalmists often speak up with, God, why is this unfair? Why do the evil prosper and why do good people suffer? So tell me how you kind of walk through some of that. Because I think, again, the book as we go on, finding purpose in all of life's sorrows and joys. But tell us how you walk through that.
Yeah. So I walked through very poorly.
Yeah.
I was 30 years old when I got that call. Pastored for 8 years, was getting ready to launch this church. And I spent the next year feeling like the good Christian response is to, cheer up, remind myself of the resurrection and move on and be hopeful. And over the course of the next year, my life was falling apart to the point where a year later, I just had very, very close friends that kind of pulled me off to the side, and they said, "Hey, John, we feel like you trying to help everybody else put their lives back together is the anesthesia that has numbed your heart to the fact that yours is falling apart, right? You don't
Mm-hmm.
need to be a Superman. You don't need to pretend that it doesn't hurt. The way that you honor your love is not to move past the grief, but it is just going to be a prolonged time where you really have to sit in and lean in and process the bitterness of it all." So for me, it was realizing that the first step, like up, is really a step down, right? If you're in a muddy ditch, your first step is not a step up. You kind of just have to sink your heels into it and realize that I may get out of this at some point, but I'm not going to get out of this unchanged, untainted. And really, I think the thing that helped me walk through it, and it's the reason why I use the first person plural in the name of the book. It's not I go on, it's not me go on, it's we go on. I had people climb down in that ditch with me and just wrap my arms around their neck, and people walked me through.
And I got to tell you, John, I don't know anybody who wrote a book on this and then went on tour. So you're kind of doing a
Right.
tour, which is, I don't know, that's tell me about that, because it's the quote, it says there aren't many unscary places to talk about grief, so we created one, unquote. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So from our standpoint, it was I realized that it was like people didn't just need light, they needed heat, right? So to talk about grief online is kind of like a fireplace screensaver, right? Where it's like, I mean, I see all the light, but I don't see the warmth. So from our standpoint, it's a everybody that I would talk to about the conversation post 2020. All right. Pre 2020, I talk about grief. And like you said, right, we aren't used to getting the call about folks really, really young. If people were 40 and above, they really were like, oh, yes, grief's needed. If people were less than 40 pre 2020, their eyes would kind of glaze over as I would talk about grief and hope because they viewed grief as something that took place to somebody else or them later. Post 2020, everybody had lived through some type of tangible or ambiguous loss. And the bulk of the stuff that I read when I was in my grief didn't really help me because it felt very clinical or it felt very it was a memoir with a singular story where if I couldn't intersect with it, then it was really just hard for me to find hope. But what I saw was that I turned on the radio and music and I would watch TV and I would hear poets and everybody that found themselves in the arts was talking about grief and loss and love in a way that like my heart came back to. And so my thought was, all right, how do we create a space where people can come in and feel seen and heard without, needing to say a word? And it was just this, gamble that I think if we create a space that would be the most pleasant experience where people could feel everything that comes with grief, right? We know that there's times when we cry, there's times when we laugh and we didn't think that we would laugh. There's times where we think, there's times that we sing, there's times that we just want to sit back and watch. And so our goal was, hey, how do you create a variety of show of sorts about the various forms of grief and just kind of put that out there and see if folks would come. And that was 3 years ago. And it was 5 cities from East Coast to West Coast. And this year it'll be, 25 cities in the US and a couple in the UK. So it's, you just find that people are hungry for a place where they can be fully human.
John Onwuchekwa is our guest. We're going to continue our conversation with him in just a moment. And your calls, 877-548-3675. By the way, John's actually in Tampa tonight. He's in Los Angeles and San Francisco next week. You can find the tour information at edstetzerlive.com. Just click there and the links, all John's links are listed there as well. We're going to continue our conversation with him and your calls. Let me give you that number again. It's 877-548-3675. Stay with us. Hey, we're back. Ed Stetzer Live. I'm Ed Stetzer. I'm actually the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University and your radio show host every Saturday at this time. Our phone number, we're talking about, grief and maybe how we express it and more than just that, too. Actually, we're going to kind of press through on some other issues as well. But our phone number, and just open these lines up. Maybe you can talk to John, walk what maybe you're walking through or how you kind of walk through situations. 877-548-3675. Again, that's 877-548-3675. As I mentioned, he's written a book. It's called We Go On, Finding Purpose in Life and All of Life's Sorrows and Joys. But also, it actually led to this tour, which he's on right now. Like I said, he's in Tampa tonight, and then he's over in L.A., and then up to San Francisco. But you can actually go to edstetzerlive.com, click through the links. You'll find just a list of places from Louisville to Detroit to Charlotte to Nashville to Raleigh. You mentioned a couple of UK locations as well, but that's the wegoontour.com if you're interested. But again, the links are all over at Ed Stetzer Live. They tell me I'm supposed to tell them go to Ed Stetzer Live, and then they yell at me if I don't. So I'm trying to be a good radio show host. Right. So talk to me a little bit about like this sort of evolved. This was like a book tour, and then it becomes you tell us the whole story.
Yeah. So coming out of the pandemic, This was 2022. The publisher was still tentative to have live in-person events January 2022 when my book comes out. And I just said I didn't want to do anything online. It was like, yeah, we talked through a fireplace screensaver. I felt like people needed to be in the room. So I would wait until we could get folks in the room. And so we planned to do an event in Atlanta of 2022. Same thing, right? It was, I had a friend who, Preston Perry, spoken word. So I brought him along, a friend, Rich Perez, who we did a film on grief. I brought him along. I had a friend, Swoop, who did music, brought him along. And it's like, hey, let's do an evening in Atlanta. Well, that turned into the venue that we were going to do it at was a friend who owned a co-working space in LA and DC. And he said, listen, people there need it too. So if you'll do it at those three spots, then we'll sponsor it. And then that turned into Houston, Dallas. And at the end of the day, it was, we didn't know if anybody would show up. And so we go to these five spots and the rooms are full everywhere that we go. And at the end of the night, after we talk about grief and hope, you know, people leave. It was just this weird combination on their face. So they had tear-stained cheeks, but they were smiling. And they said, I didn't know, right, grief and joy could sit down, right? We just kind of learn when you go through grief, right? If your life were a restaurant, grief would convince you that it has a standing reservation at every table. And it doesn't. Joy could sit down. And so people felt that. And it was surprising because it was a mixture. So we had people that were Christian, and then we had folks that were, hey, I don't have a faith background. I've actually been antagonistic towards Christianity, but I lost my mom 3 weeks ago, and I just didn't know what to do. A friend brought me here, and I never realized Christianity was about the resurrection and hope. I always thought it was rules. So you just had this space where we left and people online were like, hey, so excited. Can't wait until y'all come back next year. I've got a bunch of people that I want to bring. And so then we sat back and said, oh, all right, I think people want a next year. And so it's, all right, let's plan to do this next year. And in between those 2 years, I resigned from the church that I was at and started to work for Christianity Today for a year. And the folks there, you know, Russell Moore, Timothy Dalrymple, Joy Almond, I just kind of shared with them about what we did last year. And they're like, hey, we'd actually love to catapult this some. And so we did it last year. And my thought was, all right, let's just do this thing one more time for all the folks that we did last year and a few folks that were like, hey, you should come to Chicago or New York. And same thing, we left last year and people were like, hey, so glad that you came. I can't wait until y'all come back next year. And so it's just kind of grown like that. It's to relive the worst day of your life, night in and night out, is a very, very tough thing. And sometimes you're like, okay, I think I've talked enough about it. But every time we're ready to hang things up, people are like, no, no, no. There is a fresh loss. There's somebody freshly grieving. Somebody else has fallen into that same pit that you talked about that you came out of. And so now it's just, I think, something that we'll do in perpetuity. And this just feels like every other thing that I've been a part of. I guess this is how calling works, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple times now, you talked about how the resurrection fits into all this. And, you know, I'm actually headed to go see my my friend tomorrow. And I'm actually bringing a book. And I actually, you know, since you're connected with CDC now, I actually got Tim Keller's book, Hope in Times of Fear, the Resurrection and the Meaning of Easter.
Yeah.
So I remember when I interviewed Tim, and you know, at the time we all knew that his pancreatic cancer was I mean, it very low survivability rate. And, and all
Right.
this, people were mad at him and, navigating the cultural moment, and people in New York think he's too conservative, and people, well, anyway. And so,
Right.
he answered this lots of times, but I said to him, Tim, what's it like going through all this? And he said, if the resurrection's true, everything's going to be all right.
Everything's going to be okay.
And that's just a
Yeah.
phrase that he used in so many different places. So how does the resurrection fit into this path that we're walking through?
Yeah. So, Francis Waller, he has this book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And his point is this: most people think of grief as like a journey. And his thing is, grief is more like a communal hallway. And there are these gates that everybody has to walk through to get in. And he's like this: the very first gate that everybody walks through when it comes to grief is this truth. Everything in this world that you love, you will lose. That is gravity. That truth is not a respecter of religion, creed, background. Everybody comes to grip with everything in this world that you love, you will lose, period. Humanity has wrestled with what do we do in light of that truth. And sometimes the best that people can come up with is a philosophy of detachment. You have to learn how to let go. This inevitability is there. Let go, enjoy things while they're here. Um, Christianity says something that is unique in all of that, right? It tells the story of God who came into the world as a man to deal with death, the one thing that has puzzled and has been a cul-de-sac for everybody's hopes and dreams. And the disciples put their hopes on him, and they went through the same grief and despair that everybody else did. They saw him, right, buried, and they lived and they felt that truth. Everything in this world that you love, you will lose, full stop, period. And 3 days later, Jesus rose from the grave and took God's divine pencil and did some editing and removed the period at the end of the sentence and put a semicolon where he said, no, no, everything in this world that you love, you will lose. However, there is a future where you get back more than you ever lost. And I think while Jesus' death was one of a kind, the hope of the resurrection is that it is the first of its kind, that death is not a cul-de-sac, it is a through street, and Jesus continues to drive back down that through street and to take those of us that have put our trust in him by the hand and guide us towards life. And so that's where our hope comes from. Not that any one of us are going to be able to escape tragedy, right? We can't outrun it any more than a dog can outrun its tail. But the resurrection reminds us, no, 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 tragedy doesn't ruin anybody. Hopelessness does. And the resurrection, if it's really true, gives us the ability to hold on to hope in the most hopeless of conditions. There is not a more hopeless place than seeing a loved one wrapped up or put in a casket and dropped into the ground. And Jesus conquered the most hopeless position every human has ever seen or tasted. And so it reminds us that if he rose there, right, then what makes us think that any other condition is hopeless? We may feel hopeless, but if the resurrection is true, we are never actually hopeless. Our feelings are real, but our feelings are not reality. And that helps us persevere and walk through patiently, even the most difficult of times, even the worst of diagnoses.
We're going to get to your calls in just a second, but I want to encourage you to join us in the conversation. Our phone number is 877-548-3675. John, I want to set up, I'm probably talking more than I should, but this is obviously on my mind and my heart.
No, it's all good.
1755, everyone was in church in Lisbon, Portugal, and an earthquake came, and the earthquake kind of collapsed the churches and everyone inside. And then the fires came right afterwards, and then a tsunami came and wiped out most of the city, matter of fact, to the ground. And it changed sort of it just changed the way people thought about the goodness of God and failure and grief and things of that sort. It's a very, very famous moment in philosophy and history. Voltaire writes about this, saying he doesn't believe in a benevolent God anymore. This is something Immanuel Kant and others. And so what I want to talk about is, like, how do we face, when you get that phone call about Sam, it's kind of your great Lisbon earthquake moment. It's how do we walk through that, and how do we respond to that when we sometimes seems the world's unfair because it remapped the way people thought in Europe. And I think ultimately many of us face those great Lisbon earthquake moments. 877-548-3675. Join us and we'll continue our conversation with John Onwuchekwa in just a moment. Hey, we're back at Stetzer Live. John Onwuchekwa is our guest. He's on tour talking about grief. And again, you can find the We Go On tour and also his book of the same title, all at edstetzerlive.com. John, like I said, I'm probably talking too much because it's been heavy on my heart. I was just last night, just took some time, went by the Billy Graham Center to pray. And so it's definitely on my mind. But we all sort of, and there's this, again, in philosophy, this moment, the Great Lisbon Earthquake, is kind of a key turning point in Christian Europe kind of not being able to answer hard questions, and many people moving away from Christian faith. Because tragedies can do that. And as a pastor, you've seen what I've seen. People tend to move toward or away from their faith in the midst of tragedy. No one stays the same in the midst of grief. So, you get a call like Sam. How would, and we're going to get the calls too. Let me just say to everyone on the line as well, right after John answers, we're going to get to your calls, and others can call in as well. 877-548-3675. Again, that's 877-548-3675. But so, when we get that call, and you said you dealt with it badly, how do we respond so that we walk through this corridor of grief together?
Yeah. So this is what I learned, right? It's the tragedy of grief is the loss, right? So the loss is the tragedy, but it is the loneliness that is the source of the trauma. That's what does folks in. So Dr. Mary Catherine McDonald is going to define it like this. Trauma is when your emotional pain cannot find a relational home. So you find that it's like when people have this loss and they don't have any place to deposit it, right? What the loss doesn't destroy and undo, the loneliness does. It's like this. If you've had anybody that's ever lost anything in a house fire, people think the fire department getting there on time is the good news, that they can just put it out. But anybody that's ever walked through the smoldering remains of a house fire knows that what the fire doesn't destroy, the water does. And with grief and loss, what you find is like what the loss doesn't destroy, the loneliness does. And sorry for your loss, that term or that phrase often can be, on our worst days, the first step to just remind people that they are different, lonely. They have less than what they used to. I think the best lesson that I've learned to help somebody as they walk through their grief is not to say sorry for your loss, but to put yourself in conversations with stories about their love. Jordan and Jessica Rice, two dear friends of mine, 43, 42 years old. Jordan is actually burying his father this morning. Jordan and Jessica have been married 10 years, but they are on their second marriage because both of them were tragically widowed in their 20s. Jessica lost her spouse 2.5 months into marriage. Jordan 10 months in, his wife got a diagnosis of cancer so rare the doctor had to Google its pronunciation before he came in. And as they found themselves in relationship with person after person, the relationships would only go so deep because people would be like, oh, I don't want to talk about their loved one. I don't want to bring it back up. Sorry for your loss. And that's all that they would give. And then Jordan and Jess found each other. And for the first time, they met somebody that was fluent in widow. And they sat and had drinks the very first night. And they spent time talking about their loved ones that they lost, sharing stories. And it was interesting because in that time, they were reminded that their loved one was much more than a lost one, right? While everybody else in the world was sad about what they didn't now have, for a moment of time, they could live and relive the memories, being reminded not just of what they don't now have, but the things that they could never lose. And when you realize that grief is not an event that you move past, right? So it's unhelpful to think of grief as a journey. Journeys start, journeys end. Grief starts, and one of the things that I wish I knew at the end was that there is no earthly finish line. I spent too much time searching for some light at the end of a closed tunnel. I think grief, it's more helpful not to think of grief as a journey, but to think of grief as a language. And the goal is not to finish. The goal is to become fluent. It is to connect. It is to realize that as I grieve, my grief story is not just a grief story. It is a love story that needs to continue to be shared. And I want people to sit and to talk to me and to ask me stories about my love, not just to, say sorry for your loss, and for somebody to just sit back and to say, things are not going to be well for a long time, and it is okay that things are not well for a long time. Hope is never hurried, but it always comes on time. And if I got that call today and I could sit with myself 10 years ago, I would just sit with myself. I would tie our left legs together and I would say, hey, for the next few years, this is going to be a 3-legged race, and me and you are just going to walk very, very closely together.
John Nwachukwu is our guest. Remember, you can go to edstetcherlive.com to hear about the tour. Actually, I want to ask in a minute, but I want to get to our calls. But I want to ask, what do you do at these tour stops? I think people would find that interesting. Right. But let's get to some calls first. Let's go to Lydia in Riverside, California. Lydia, you're live on the air. Jump right in.
Hi, good morning. Yes, I'm 75 years old, and I've had different health issues. And I just recently was told that I have blockage in my carotid artery, and which gives me more realistic, I'm sorry, I'm kind of nervous.
It's okay.
My mortality, it's
sure.
more, I'm praying that nothing bad will happen, but I'm realistic that eventually something will. And I have grandchildren that are, well, the oldest is like 25, and the youngest are from 12 to 8. There's 5 more. So I don't know how to prepare them, because I don't, I know I'm going to die one of these days, and I know I'm prepared with the Lord, but I want to prepare them. I don't want to. Yeah. We've had my husband left me a couple of years ago, and he left all of us. He didn't say bye to anybody. He just dropped. The kids are always wondering where they're at. I don't want that to happen with me and the kids. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Lydia, thank you. Thank you for your call and such a, I feel the hurt and the uncertainty. And so, John, this is kind of a sense of almost like a preparatory grief. How would she prepare how would Lydia prepare her grandchildren here?
Yeah. So I think we can prepare them for death by talking about death often, or we can prepare them for death by investing in the present as much as we can so that when we leave, they are reminded, right, that from your standpoint, you felt like the best use of your life was preparing them to live well in a world that you wouldn't be in, right? So we don't prepare people for death and grief just by talking a whole lot about grief and death. To do so does take away from the joy and the gift of being fully present, right? Grief and the thought of it is something that's meant to sober us up. Everything in this world that we love, we will lose. But that statement is not one that's meant to make us sad. It's meant to make us sober, a better, more present version of ourselves. That whenever we neglect our grandkids or our loved ones, when our noses are buried in our phone, right? That thought about grief slithers up the back of our spine, taps us on the shoulder, and whispers in our ears, everything in this world that you love, you will lose. Hug those grandkids. Don't miss a birthday. Spend time. Talk. Tell them stories about your childhood. Invest, invest, invest. Grief would make you feel like the best way to prepare them is to have constant conversations about your death. But the the constant intrusive thoughts about your mortality should serve as a divine alarm clock to make sure that you invest as much time as you can in the present and you hug them tightly every chance that you get.
Mm-hmm. Going to continue our conversation with John on Woodchuckwa in just a moment. Remember, you can go to edstetzerlive.com, head over to the We Go On tour, find out more about his book as well. Kind of a sobering conversation, important one, obviously something I'm thinking through as well. I want to take your calls. We have one segment. We're going to go right to the calls, 877-548-3675. Again, last chance to call in, 877-548-3675. We're going to jump to the calls in just a second. Okay, we're back. Final segment. Got about 9 minutes, 30 seconds left in the show. So callers, want to ask you to jump right to the question, and we'll kind of, I don't know, maybe I'll have a lightning round, John. So we'll kind of try to move through these callers as we can.
We'll go quick.
First, we're going to go to Raj. Raj, you're live on the air. Go ahead.
Thank you. I find that sometimes grief takes days or weeks or months. But my question is, when you were sitting in that steakhouse and you got slapped in the face with the news of your brother, what were the one or two things that you went to right then that helped you process that slap in the face?
Good question. Jump right in, John.
One of my best friends of 23 years was there with me. College roommate, met him on the first day of school in 2002. He was there with me. And the only thing I did was I ran into his arms and hugged him. I do not remember much of that next day. The next thing I remember is it was nighttime. We were driving back to Atlanta from Orlando so I could catch a flight out. And my brother was a preacher. And I remember I was just playing his last sermon. I just wanted to hear his voice. So people, yeah.
It's a lot, man. And you're leaning back into that grief even as you go through this, which is a gift to other people, but also weighs on us. Thank you for your call, Raj. We appreciate that. Mary in Las Vegas, you're live on the air. Let's jump right in. Okay, we're going to try to go back to Mary in just a bit. Let's go to Lori in Lakeland, Florida. Lori, you're live on the air. Go right ahead.
Yes, thanks for taking my call. What I wanted to talk about, I'm in my 60s right now, but when I was 20, my father committed suicide. And at that time, back in the 80s, people just didn't, talk about it. It was something that it was almost embarrassing. Yeah. It really affected me because nobody in my family wanted to really talk about it. I didn't, and I was pretty young. I felt like 20s at that time was really young. It really affected me because even in relationships, it was something I just couldn't have anybody, delve into because it was embarrassing. And it really, so I just wanted to make a point. It really, now that that's talked about a lot more, that it's really a healing process because it really affected my relationships, for a long, long time.
Yeah, it does. It has an indelible mark. Lori, thanks for your call. If you'll hold on the line, too, we want to give you a copy of John Onwuchekwa's book, We Go On. So, John, talk to us about this. I mean, it seems that sometimes we grieve not in the, like you expect, well, I'm going to grieve these 3 months and then a little less grief 6 months, but sometimes it could be decades. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I do want to mention is everybody knows or hears or has heard of the 5 stages of grief. And so let me just kind of help folks with this. The 5 stages of grief are a myth.
Yep.
They are not based in any kind of science.
Nobody teaches that anymore in counseling programs or things of that sort. Yeah.
Yeah. It was created by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it's actually the 5 stages of dying. She studied terminal patients on their way to death, not the people that they left behind. That's right. And so anybody that thinks it's like, I'm just not moving through or progressing, it's because, that is a custom suit that's not made for you if you grieve. What you find out is that as time and the years go on, it's not that grief subsides, it's that it changes, right? Everything in your life is tainted in some ways, right? My brother took his last breath 2 years to the day my daughter took her first unassisted breath. And that all took place on a Good Friday. And you realize that, grief is kind of this lifelong road. Every milestone that she hits, every celebration I have has an asterisk next to it because I'm reminded that Sam will never get to see her love for basketball that he instilled in me and all of these things. And so you just kind of have to sit back and know, hey, no, grief is a winding road that goes throughout the entire life. You're going to be on that road, but hope is also a winding road, and they intersect at multiple points. And the beautiful thing is that being at the intersection of grief and hope, you do not have to choose, right? You can, drop tears from your eyes with the corners of your mouth curled upwards, right? Joy, sorrow, grief, hope. It is, constants for this life that we're on. And so, the main thing I would just say is it is a lifelong thing. Get out of our minds that it is a journey that has some earthly end. We do know that there will be an other worldly end one day where every tear is wiped from our eyes. But until then, we live with grief and joy being roommates in the same heart.
Yeah. And I think I probably was too strong about the Kubler-Ross model a moment ago, just because people need to stop seeing it as stage 1. Nobody teaches anymore that this is stage 1. But the reality is we bounce around these things, anger and denial and bargaining, and it's all part of that as well. So part of that as well. All right, let's continue to get to some of our calls here. Let's go to Mary in Las Vegas. Mary, you're live on the air. Go right ahead.
Hi, thank you for taking the call. Can you hear me?
Yes, please jump right in.
Yeah.
So, like I told the screener, my husband passed away 2.5 years ago. Now, we were together like 30 years, but he made an honest woman out of me 8 years ago. He supplied everything that he could. Hard worker. I was a single parent. He took my kids in, and we made a move to Vegas from Cali, and he didn't want to go. But he came in at a time where his other children had just dropped everything. They came. So he was able to spend 1 year and a day with his children. I see the God in it. I see, but what I did not anticipate the hereafter. We were so caught up in the now.
Mary,
Hey,
Mary,
Rick.
Mary, sorry to interrupt you. You keep clicking in and out, but go ahead and get to your question so we can have John weigh
I
in.
don't know. So how do I manage? How do I go forward? There are times when I feel stuck. There's
Yeah.
times that, I miss so much.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Mary. I'm so sorry. And so
Yeah.
John, let's weigh in.
Yeah. Mary, I would say you move forward slowly. Grieving is learning, right? We do not move through the world as the world is. We move through the world as our brain thinks that it is. So if you think of your brain as a GPS, there's been a major landscape change out there, and it's going to take some time for your brain and your heart to update, right? There's constantly going to be thoughts that come in where you want to send a text and you realize that there's nobody on the end there. And I would just say, yeah, grieving is learning. All right. It is a thing. It is not a good or a bad thing. It is not an obstruction. It is a thing. And it just takes time for us to learn how to navigate through the world without somebody that was such an important part of it. And so the main thing that I would say is there's a lot to grieve, and I don't want you to add shame into the mix or feeling frustrated that you're not someplace that you shouldn't be. You're right where you need to be. The depth of your grief is a testament to the depth of your love. And so move forward slowly, and one day you'll look back and you'll see that maybe there's more smiles than tears. But in the meantime, just be okay, walking slowly.
John Muchuk has been our guest. We've been talking about We Go On, which is also a tour. It's a book he's written as well, and I think a gift to many of us, me included. Again, go to ed-live.com. You can click right through the links and get more information there. Thanks for listening.